So quickly recapping what we did on Monday. Well, we look into Doppler, uh, the mechanism of Doppler, and some of the things that we use Doppler to do, and the different types of Doppler. We talk about a pulse wave Doppler, where when you generate the ultrasound, you send out pulse of ultrasound, and you measure velocity of blood at a single point. The transducer sends out a signal and then wait for the reflected signal. So remember, the transducer, what it does, it produces the sound wave. The sound wave travels to the tissue, reflected off the tissue, and then come back, and you can observe the image. So that is how the pulse wave Doppler operates. It sends out the ultrasound in pulse. It's not a continuous thing. So it sends out pulse, say 3 pulse, and then wait a little bit for the reflected echoes. So there's the transducer itself is alternating between transmission and the reception. So, and then these are the different velocities that we use the pulse wave Doppler to measure relatively low velocities. And as we said before, velocities of the order of 1.5 to 2 meters per second. And so the mitral inflow, the left ventricular flow track, the hepatic vein, tissue Doppler imaging, pulmonary vein, and tricuspid inflow velocity. And we look at, this is the mitral inflow. The reason why it's above the baseline as opposed to be below the baseline. So if there's flow towards the transducer, it's going to give you an envelope or a spectral display above the baseline. So this is the mitral inflow. Your transducer is depicted right there. Blood is going to flow from the left atrium, cross the mitral valve into the left ventricle, so you get the impulse above the baseline. And we talk about the E velocity and the A velocity, and we describe the details about those. It's the left ventricular outflow tract. Your cursor is right here. Sample volume is right in the left ventricular outflow tract. Your transducer is right there. Blood is going to flow from the LV cavity across the LVOT and into the aorta. It's going to move away from the transducer and it's below the baseline. It's a systolic flow, so everything we do in echo is gated. That what we mean by that is either a systolic flow or a diastolic flow. We went over that in detail. This is your hepatic vein flow. There's a systolic component, there's a diastolic component, and then you have an atrial flow reversal. Okay. This is the tissue Doppler. We're actually looking at the movement of the tissue, the velocity of the tissue. So it's not going to be in the same order as, say, the blood flow. The velocity of the tissue is going to be less. We usually talk about centimeters per second, as opposed when we're talking about the blood flow, we talk about meters per second. So we can look at the medial, and we look at the mitral annulus. So we can look at the medial mitral annulus or the lateral mitral annulus, or the same thing as septal and lateral. And when you put your sample volume right there and you turn your tissue Doppler on, then in systole, the mitral annulus is going to move upwards. So your transducer is right here. So you're going to get a systolic component. In diastole, is going to move downwards. So you get two diastolic components. You have an E prime and an A prime. So that's your tissue Doppler. Okay, the pulmonary vein flow. So you have your apical four-chamber on top. Your transducer is right there. You have one pulmonary vein is right there, another is right there. Remember, the pulmonary veins drain into the left atrium. The pulmonary veins drain into the left atrium. So in ventricular systole, which is from the onset of the QRS to the end of the T wave, blood is going to flow from the pulmonary vein into the left atrium, and you get a spectral display like this. This is the systolic component. In diastole, blood is still going to flow from the pulmonary vein into the left atrium, so you get your diastolic component. But when the atrium contracts, it's going to push blood in the opposite direction. It's going to push blood backwards into the pulmonary vein, so you get what we call an atrial flow reversal. Okay, so pulmonary vein. And tricuspid inflow, pretty much the same thing. Transducer is right there. This is the right atrium, tricuspid valve, right ventricle. Blood is going to flow from the right atrium across the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. It's going to move towards the transducer, and it's going to be above the baseline. And just like the mitral inflow, you get a E velocity and an A velocity. Okay, so these are the limitations of pulse wave Doppler. It is limited by its inability to measure high blood flow velocities. It cannot measure blood flow velocities more than 1.5 to 2 meters per second. If you have any velocity greater than 1.5 to 2 meters per second, you're going to get what we call aliasing. It's going to, once it gets to that 1.5 to 2 meters per second, it's going to cut off the velocity and put a portion at the bottom, or in some cases put it at the top. Okay, so aliasing is represented on the spectral trace as a cutoff of a given velocity, and this is what is meant by the aliasing. So, okay, so we're looking at aortic insufficiency, and you don't know what the spectral display of aortic insufficiency looks like, but anyway, it looks like it's supposed to look like this. Okay, it's a diastolic flow, aortic insufficiency, and it has this trapezoid configuration. But if you're using a P doubler, if you look here, you see the full, each of these dots is 1 meter per second. So this is 1, 2, 3 meters per second. So that's the velocity. But if you're using a P doubler to assess it, once it gets to 2 meters per second, cuts off the top and puts it at the bottom. Whereas if you use something that can measure higher velocity, if you use a modality that can measure higher velocity, you can see the full spectral display. Okay, it goes up to 3 meters per second, and you can see the whole thing, and it doesn't put anything at the bottom. Okay, so that modality, if you have high velocity, is what we call continuous wave Doppler. So if you have high velocities and you want to measure the velocity and you want to get gradient and stuff like that, you have to use continuous wave Doppler. So your continuous wave Doppler measures blood flow velocities along the entire line of interrogation. What we mean by that, the transducer is continuously sending out pulses of ultrasound and continuously listening for the reflected frequency coming backwards. Whereas your pulse wave, if you have a transducer that using as a pulse wave, using a pulse wave Doppler, it sends out pulses periodically. Whereas your continuous wave Doppler is sending out pulses continuously. It's continuously sending out pulse, and it continuously looking for the reflected wave coming backwards. So it is sending and receiving at all time, different from your pulse wave Doppler. So we can use continuous wave Doppler to measure high velocity. We can use it to measure high velocities. And an example of that is mitral regurgitation. So again, you have your two-dimensional echo on top. This is the transducer. Um, your cursor is across the mitral valve. The sample volume is right at the mitral valve. With mitral regurgitation, blood is going to flow from the LV across the mitral valve into the left atrium. And the blood is going to be flowing away from the transducer. Hence, it's going to be below the baseline, and it's a systolic flow because the left ventricle is going to contract in systole. So in systole, the LV is going to contract and force blood across the mitral valve into the left atrium. So it's a systolic flow below the baseline. But if you measure the velocity, this is 2/4, almost 5 meters per second. Usually, mitral regurg velocities are usually fairly high, of the order of 5 meters per second. So you can't use your pulse wave Doppler to measure mitral regurgitation. You have to use continuous wave Doppler. Similarly, with most tricuspid regurgitation, the velocities usually, usually above 1.52 meters per second, but you can get some that are lower. Again, this is a short axis at the level of the aorta. The aorta is right there. Your cursor is across the tricuspid valve. The sample volume is across the tricuspid. The sample volume is right to the tricuspid leaflet. With tricuspid regurgitation, blood is going to flow from the RV across the tricuspid valve into the right atrium. It's going to move away from the transducer. So the tricuspid regurgitation, the blood is moving away from the transducer, and it's going to be below the baseline. It's going to be below the baseline, and it's a systolic flow again. So when you look at your ECG, systole is from the onset of the QRS to the end of the T wave. Okay, so this is what your tricuspid regurgitation looks like, and it's 1 to roughly 3 meters per second. You cannot use pulse wave Doppler for that. Okay. Also, if you have a patient with aortic stenosis, if the patient have aortic stenosis, so this is a apical four-chamber view. The cursor is across the tricuspid valve. The sample volume is right at the tricuspid valve. And when you turn on your continuous wave Doppler, picture a garden hose. So picture a garden hose, your regular hose you use to, water your lawn. If you narrow the nozzle of the garden hose, the velocity of the water coming out is going to be increased. And you can get the water to go further. So that's what aortic stenosis or any type of stenosis is. So you get a systolic flow, and the velocity is usually fairly high. But let's look at it from first principles. So this is your LV cavity right there. Again, this is your transducer, LV cavity, the aortic valve. Blood in systole, blood is going to force its way across the aortic valve into the aorta. But because the aortic valve is narrowed, the velocity is going to be increased. So this is what it looks like. Because the blood is flowing away from the transducer, it's below the baseline. Okay? So the blood is flowing away from the transducer, it's going to be below the baseline. Okay? And you can measure the velocity. It's about 3.64 meters per second. Again, the velocity is greater than your 1.5 to 2 meters per second, so you can't use pulse wave Doppler for that. Now, when when we look at echoes, you see color going all over the place, and it must be confusing until you understand what's happening. So color flow Doppler is a form of pulse wave Doppler. So that's the first thing. Your color flow Doppler, so the beautiful color that we put on and we look at our echoes, it's a form of pulse wave Doppler. And what we mean by that, it can only measure low velocity flow. So, but there's some standardization that you need to understand. If the blood is flowing towards the transducer, the color that you're going to see is red. Blood flow towards the transducer, it's depicted as red. Blood flow away from the transducer is in the different shades of blue. So those are concepts you have to get right away. Okay? So the returning echoes is displayed as an assigned color, and flow towards the transducer are seen as shades of red. Flow away from the transducer are seen as shades of blue. So when you see all those colors going all over the place, you have to slow it down and figure out what's going on there. However, if you have turbulence, so you're going to have turbulence if the patient has significant regurgitation, mitral regurgitation, tricuspid regurgitation, any type of regurgitation, you're going to have turbulence. Also, if the patient has stenosis, they're going to be turbulence. Because if there's no obstruction, you're going to get a nice laminar flow. But once you have any type of regurgitation or obstruction, you're going to get turbulence. And when you look at the color, turbulence is seen as a mosaic. That is a mixture of many colors. And once we start looking at the regurgitation, then you'll fully appreciate that. If there's no flow, everything looks black. No flow, it looks black. And then faster velocities are displayed in shades of blue or red, brighter shades of blue or red, because the faster velocity could be towards the transducer or it could be away from the transducer. Okay? So let's look at this. So again, you have to locate your transducer. Transducer is right there. Okay, this is the parasternal axis view. This is your aortic valve. This is the mitral valve. So in systole, blood is going to flow from the LV cavity, cross the aortic valve, and it's going to go into the aorta. So it's actually moving somewhat towards the transducer. So this flow is going to look red. Okay. There's a flow right here. There's a flow right here. Okay. And this flow is across the mitral valve. Okay. The flow is across the mitral valve. And if we say this is systole, then this, systolic flow across the mitral valve is mitral regurgitation, but it's moving in this direction. The flow is moving here. It's actually moving away from the transducer. So it's going to be in varying shades of blue. Flow towards the transducer, varying shades of red. Flow away from the transducer is going to be varying shades of blue. Okay, short axis at the level of the aorta. Tricuspid valve is right there. This is the RV. This is the RA. Your transducer is right there. There's a flow moving from the RV across the tricuspid valve into the right atrium, and that's tricuspid regurgitation. But because of the increased velocity, you can see it's not pure blue. It's actually a mixture of color, and this is what we call mosaic or turbulence. This is how we depict turbulence using color flow. It's a mixture of the colors. So we expect, since it's moving away from the transducer, it should be blue, but because of the turbulence, we get this mixture of color mosaic. All right, transducers right there, parasternal long axis view. So this is our aortic valve. This is a diastolic frame. So something is happening in diastole across the aortic valve. This is aortic insufficiency, aortic regurgitation. So in diastole, when the aortic valve is closed, there is blood flowing backwards across the aortic valve. It's actually moving away from the transducer, and that's why it's in blue. That's why it looks blue. Flow towards the transducer, varying shades of red. Flow away from the transducer, varying shades of blue. So, knowing these basic, getting these basic information down, you can work out most things. Okay, so we're going to stop here, and next week Monday we're going to look at some more color. We're going to look at some more Dopplers, so you can fully grasp the concept. We're going to look at more regurgitation, more normal flow. We'll see if we can get some shunts and stuff like that, so you can get a full understanding of Doppler. All right. Any question?